I'm Mark Stoller, for those of you who don't know me, the program chair. So before I introduce tonight's speakers, our remaining speakers for the year, let me just quickly walk through. March 16th, Chris DeRose is going to be speaking on the President's War, which is about Lincoln and his 5 living predecessors at the time of the Civil War and their relationship, which is a fascinating story. On April 20th, we'll have a longtime roundtable favorite, Frank O'Reilly is going to be returning. He'll talk about Malvern Hill, Retreat from Victory. And on May 11th, we'll conclude the season with Brian Wills. He's going to be returning to the roundtable with a very interesting little offbeat topic, which is Inglorious Passages, Non-Combat Deaths in the Civil War. I think you'll find it fascinating. As with all the Zoom presentations and sessions we do, we ask that you stay on mute while the speaker presents. If you have questions at any time, just use the chat function, which is at the bottom of your screen, and you can write your questions in either while Will is speaking or when we get to the Q&A at the end. And then I'll be giving the questions to Will from there. As far as tonight's speaker, A. Wilson Greene has a long and distinguished career as author, lecturer, and preservationist. He's the author of several highly acclaimed books on the Petersburg Campaign, including A Campaign of Giants, The Battle for Petersburg, from the crossing of the James to the Battle of the Crater. As John mentioned, he was from 1995 to 2017 president and CEO of Pamphlet Historical Park and the National Museum of the Civil War Soldier. And he transformed privately owned land into one of the premier Civil War era historic sites. And prior to that, Will worked for the National Park Service as an historian of Petersburg National Battlefield and of Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania County Battlefields National Military Park. For the past 30 years, he's been one of 2 Civil War scholars employed by the Smithsonian to lead touring programs of Civil War battlefields. He has, as I said, a long and distinguished career. So welcome, Will, and tell us about the crater.
Very good. Now, Tom is going to walk me through getting on this PowerPoint program. I guess I need to go on to share screen, right? Tom?
Yes, your PowerPoint's open right now, correct?
It is?
Yep, so share screen. Then it'll bring up the little box in the bottom. You should see your PowerPoint and then click on that and we should be good.
I am going to do it here and we'll see if we can't get it to full screen. There we go. Excellent. That's amazing for an historian to do something technical without any mistakes. We're off to a great start. And Mark, I really appreciate the opportunity to be with you. John, I am so impressed that you have 394 members. That makes you one of the top 2 or 3 roundtables in the entire country. And those of us who do these talks, we talk to each other about which groups we want to go to and which groups treat you right. And I just want you to know that you have a wonderful reputation amongst us who are in the Civil War history profession. And obviously you all do a great job and it's really a pleasure to be with you. As I said, I'm delighted to be out here in Scottsdale with my World War II D-Day dad. Since it's 16 degrees and snowing on Walden's Ridge in Southeast Tennessee, I'm particularly glad to be here. And I appreciate all of you joining us this evening. I suspect that most of us are drawn to Civil War history because of the, at least to some extent, because of the inspiration, the heroism, the examples of wonderful behavior, self-sacrifice that Civil War history gives us all. And so I guess this is a little bit of a disclaimer tonight in that I'm not sure we're going to find the next 45 or 50 minutes all that inspiring. But I think many of you are familiar, at least in broad outlines, with the Battle of the Crater. Now, the Petersburg campaign lasted 292 days, but July 30th, 1864, I think is the day that resonates with most casual students of the Civil War because it was the date of the infamous Battle of the Crater. And the basic outlines, I think, have been covered in most of the books about the Civil War. A regiment of Pennsylvania coal miners construct a tunnel underneath a prominent Confederate fort. They packed tons of black powder in the tunnel. The mine is exploded. Grant is supposedly has made a diversion to the north side of the James so that the Confederates around Petersburg are vulnerable. Union infantry follows the explosion, especially with black troops that are specially trained for the attack. But the disorganized white troops, whose commander is drunk in a rear area bomb-proof, are slaughtered. The African-American soldiers are eventually allowed to go forward, and they suffer disproportionate casualties, and Grant refers to the whole occasion as the saddest affair of the war. So I'm going to elaborate a little bit on that earlier narrative and perhaps dispel a few myths, offer a few correctives that have endured for generations about this memorable event in Civil War history. Now, our story really begins on June 18th, 1864, with the last of a series of Union attacks against Petersburg that commenced 3 days earlier. Now, this assault brought Union troops of Ambrose Burnside's 9th Army Corps to within 150 yards of a Confederate strongpoint known as Pegram's or Elliott's Salient. And that is this area right here that I'm highlighting with the cursor. The Confederates had actually constructed this fort rather hastily on the night of June 17th and 18th, and they had mislocated it a little bit farther forward than they intended to. It was occupied by infantry commanded by Brigadier General Stephen Elliott of South Carolina, his South Carolina Infantry Brigade, of PGT Beauregard's Department of North Carolina and Southern Virginia, and a 4-gun battery of Virginians commanded by a fellow named Captain Richard G. Pegram. But despite the salient's vulnerability, it was aided by having strong flanking fire from both the north and the south. Now, as the Federals of the 9th Corps that you see represented here on the cursor were looking at this strong point on the Confederate line, they recognized that a conventional frontal attack would have been suicidal. But some unidentified anonymous member of the 48th Pennsylvania Regiment in a brigade commanded by this fellow, Lieutenant Colonel Henry Pleasants, thought that if the Federals could dig a mine shaft underneath that fort, they could blow it sky high. Now, Pleasants ran this idea up the chain of command to his division commander, Robert Potter, to his corps commander, Burnside, and both of them quickly passed, and Pleasants obtained his blessing, their blessing for that. Burnside then approached Army Commander George Gordon Meade and received what he termed assent rather than approval of the work. Now, construction on the mine began June 25th, and the standard story regarding the digging of the mine comes generally from Pleasants' post-battle testimony, and it paints a picture of deliberate obstruction by Meade and his staff. I think benign neglect comes a little closer to the truth. Although Meade's headquarters didn't actively thwart the endeavor, neither did they offer much help. Now, the first job that Pleasants had to do was to figure out the trajectory of the mine. Now, that would be a very simple process under normal circumstances. You would take an instrument called a theodolite, which was like a transit, and you'd take a triangulation measurement towards your target, and then you'd go forward. But obviously, under these circumstances, Colonel Pleasants couldn't stand up on top of the ridge and take readings of the Confederate fort. In fact, when he went up to take his initial view of it with a staff officer, the staff officer took a bullet right in the head. And so what Pleasants did was he got 4 or 5 members of his staff and had them stand about 50 feet off to his right, just below the ridge that concealed the Federals from the Confederate viewpoint. And he had those staff officers raise their kepis on top of their swords. And that drew Confederate fire. Pleasants, in the meantime, had fashioned a burlap sack with eye holes cut in it. And he put dirt on top of the burlap sack and popped his head up over the ridge and took readings with what was called an old-fashioned theodolite, because the chief engineer of the Army of the Potomac wouldn't give him the best theodolite at headquarters, and he took his readings that way. He had to fashion his own tools for excavating the mine. He had to obtain lumber for the shoring of the mine, and all the labor to dig it had to come from his own regiment, the old 48th Pennsylvania, which, by the way, boasted about 100 coal miners in their civilian occupations, and Pleasants himself was a renowned mining engineer. So in addition to all these problems with supplies and materials, Pleasants had to devise a means to dispose of the excavated earth so the Confederates wouldn't see a whole pile of earth and wonder what was going on. They had to overcome a stratum of marl, which created a need to change the elevation of the mine. And I think the thing that made the skeptics at headquarters so dismissive of the potential for effect of this mine was the issue of ventilation. The chief engineer of the Army of the Potomac, a man named James Duane, had actually written the manual on digging mines. There was nothing innovative about mining in military history at this point. But according to Duane, you could not ventilate a mine shaft longer than 400 feet. And this shaft would be considerably longer than that. So how was Pleasants going to overcome this problem? Well, he used the principle hot air rises. He dug a 20-foot ventilation shaft from just below the ridgeline that concealed the Federal diggers down into near the mouth of the tunnel. He put a grate at the bottom of that 20-foot deep shaft, and he built a fire in that grate, kept a fire going constantly. He then laid a wooden pipe or duct from outside the entrance to the mine to as far back as where the miners were digging. Finally, he closed the entrance to the mine shaft with an airtight canvas door. The fire created a vacuum within the mine shaft, which sucked the hot and bad air out. And that vacuum was filled with the fresh air coming through the duct. Now, would OSHA have approved this? I don't think so. But I have not read anything in all the accounts from any of the diggers that said they had any trouble breathing, at least sufficiently, in order to maintain their work. Now, on July 23rd, Pleasants completed the shaft and then began building these two lateral galleries that you see here on the cursor. The shaft itself was 510 feet, 0.8 inches long, and the lateral galleries added about another 75 feet to the digging. Then they began putting powder into these bins that you see represented in the lateral gallery. Now, Burnside had asked for 12,000 pounds of powder. They gave him 8,000 pounds. And how are you going to get 8,000 pounds of powder into a 510-foot long tunnel that's about 4.5 feet high? Well, they fitted out soldiers with yokes, like what you would see with maybe an oxen dragging a wagon. And they put little baskets at each end of the yoke. So the soldier would put the yoke over his shoulders. 25-pound kegs of black powder would be put in each of the baskets. So each guy would be carrying 50 pounds of powder. They'd have to bend over to get through the tunnel, walk with these 50 pounds, 510 feet, through a tunnel that was illuminated by candles. Think about that for a while. But they did it in less than 18 hours. The next thing they did was to tamp the entrance to the lateral galleries. And this, I don't know if you can even read that, but it says tamping and end of tamping. It's about 40 feet of tamping. And what they did was they put large logs and sandbags in the tamping so that when the explosion occurred, it would go up and not back out through the back of the tunnel. And then they laid redundant fuses, about 98 feet of fuses, into little shafts that they dug in the ground that they also sprinkled with powder. Now, Pleasance had asked for mining fuse, which was waterproof and came in long lengths. The Army sent him regular fuse, which came in short lengths and wasn't waterproof. And consequently, they had to splice these short lengths together to get that 98 feet. But by golly, everything seemed to work pretty well. Now, the one thing that didn't work too well was Pleasant's desire to keep the digging secret. He had not only to keep it secret from the Confederates, but also from talkative Union sentries. And that didn't work so well. For example, men of the 20th Michigan routinely referred to Pegram Salient as the mined fort. Private George A. Spencer of the 7th Rhode Island wrote his parents on June 29th that, quote, "Our folks are digging under a fort here with the intention of blowing it up." Although Private John Wesley Ringler of 9th Corps Artillery Battery, who also reported mining to the home folks, admonished them that, quote, "If there is nothing of the above in the papers, don't make it public, as I guess old Grant don't want it known." Well, the rumors became pretty obvious to the Confederates, who sort of smelled a rat, and they began digging countermines. And you see in this diagram a couple of the countermines, the evidence of which is still on the ground today, incidentally. You can still see the depressions of the ground where these countermines were located. Eventually, these Confederate engineers dug 370 feet of countermines, but none of them were quite deep enough to intercept the tunnel. And so by the last week of July, skepticism about the mine turned to ridicule within the Confederate ranks. A Confederate classicist considered the story that the Federals were trying to dig old Uncle Robert out of his trenches a Herculean task too great for even the mighty Ulysses. But I haven't been able to find a sarcastic rejection of the mine's existence that matched Lee's Adjutant General, Walter Taylor, who with his tongue firmly planted in his cheek, wrote his fiancée, quote, that Burnside has some thousands of Negroes underground, not dead and buried, mining our works. He is said to have gotten as far as Sycamore Street, which was about 2 miles away in downtown Petersburg, and is believed running a train of cars underneath, as smoke is constantly seen to exude through paving stones by gentlemen returning to camp after night who have been entertained by kind people who treat them to ice water and straws, which was Taylor's euphemism for drunken soldiers. These, with the secession of Illinois and the burial of Grant, are the only items of news that have reached me up to this hour. As Grant has been buried, I presume it is his ghost that is undermining Petersburg, and this makes the matter only the more terrible. So thus, despite the practical challenges and the lack of strict security, Pleasant's mining endeavor had really been a success. But the question that remained was, what role would the mine play in Union strategy? In fact, the mine barely registered initially in Grant's strategy for what would become known as his third Petersburg offensive. Now, the Union General-in-Chief had placed his primary trust in an offensive north of the James River, designed to interdict the railroad coming from the Shenandoah Valley and perhaps penetrate Richmond's defenses itself. Relying on Winfield Scott Hancock's 2nd Corps and 2 of Phil Sheridan's cavalry divisions, Meade thought that, Grant really told Meade that he could ignite the mine at his leisure without any reference to any larger operational purpose. Now, this goes against the general things that you read about the crater. Now, Hancock's and Sheridan's offensive, which is styled the first deep bottom operation, failed dismally in fighting from July 26th through 28th. And this map is much too complicated. You don't need to worry about the details, but this is the area of deep bottom. And this is where Hancock and Sheridan landed, crossed the James, and ran into a great deal of trouble. The only thing that it did accomplish was to result in Robert E. Lee shifting all but 3 of his infantry divisions to the north side with the intent of annihilating all the Union forces on the left bank of the James. Now, Grant would confess that, quote, "We have failed in what I hope to accomplish." But he added that, "I am in yet of hopes of turning this diversion to account so as to yield greater results than if the first object had been accomplished." In other words, with the failure at deep bottom, the Ninth Corps' mind now moved front and center to Union strategy, although the deep bottom initiative was never a diversion until Grant termed it such after it flopped. In truth, the explosion of the mine and the subsequent attack was an afterthought, not Grant's primary gambit in his third offensive. Now, Burnside's 4th Division was composed of 2 African-American brigades. These troops were largely innocent of any combat experience, but like their brothers in the 18th Corps, who had performed so well during the initiative assaults on Petersburg, they were eager to prove their worth as soldiers. These 4,300 men, recruited primarily from free men from the north, not former slaves, were led by this fellow, Brigadier General Edward Ferrero. Quite a well-looking man with a stylish beard and a pedigree of all things as a dancing master at West Point, but fairly broad combat experience under Burnside. Ferrero's foppish appearance and mannerisms generated some derision in the Union Army, but Grant seemed to like him. Burnside's 3 white divisions had been very badly bloodied during the first offensive, and the survivors lacked a certain enthusiasm for any more frontal attacks, prompting Burnside to turn to his black troops as the spearhead that would follow the explosion of his mine. Somebody's talking there. There we go. I think it's become an article of faith in the Petersburg literature that Ferrero's men received extensive training for their unique assignment. But in my research for this, I think that assertion is a little bit sketchy. Now, there's no question, various witnesses did report that they had seen black troops drilling for several weeks prior to the assault. But on the other side, say Colonel Delavan Bates, who was the commander of the 30th United States Colored Troops, one of the units designated to lead the charge, testified that he had no knowledge of the mine's existence, let alone his regiment's role in exploiting it, until 8 days before the explosion. A white officer named Robert Beecham of the 23rd USCT stated, quote, "I was on duty with my company and regiment every day from the 22nd of June until after the Battle of the Mine, and am prepared to say from actual knowledge derived from personal experience that the only duty assigned to our division for more than a month before the battle was work upon our trenches and fortifications." Ferrero's own after-action report, penned on August 1st, made no mention of any specific training for his men. Well, this conflicting evidence leaves the matter in some doubt, but I think it's pretty clear that the black troops were not the beneficiaries of elaborate and extensive training, undermining the argument that you will sometimes read that if they had been allowed to lead the attack as Burnside envisioned, the result would have been different. But of course, the blacks would not be permitted to spearhead the assault because Meade and Grant vetoed their role. Meade so informed Burnside on the 28th, shortly after the explosion of the mine became central to Grant's operations. And remember that Meade and Burnside did not get along at all. So Meade was skeptical of this Burnside's initiative here from day one. The Army commander explained to Burnside that such a complex and important task was simply too much to expect from combat neophytes. And moreover, if the attack failed, he and Grant would be accused of caring nothing for the black soldiers. Burnside protested vigorously, basing his objections as much upon the demoralization of his white divisions as on the potential prowess of Ferrero's men. Now, Meade relented to the extent of agreeing to place the matter before Grant for his consideration, and Burnside returned to his headquarters hopeful that the general-in-chief would sustain him. In this, he would be disappointed, although it was not until 11 o'clock the following morning that Meade informed Burnside that Grant had agreed that the blacks should not lead the attack, although in his memoirs, Grant places the decision entirely with Meade. Now, up until this point, Burnside had done everything right, but now he made a critical error. He called a meeting of all of his white division commanders and asked each of them to volunteer for the leadership role, but none of them raised their hand. Now, instead of insisting that one of his competent two division heads, Robert Potter or a fellow named Orlando Wilcox, assume the responsibility, Burnside left the decision up to chance. And he had all three of his white division commanders draw straws to see who would assume the responsibility. And as fate would have it, the first division commander drew the short straw. This man was Brigadier General James Ledlie, a 32-year-old civil engineer from Utica, New York, who by using self-promotion and his relationship with Secretary of State and fellow New Yorker William Seward, managed to gain a brigadier's star and eventually a brigade command in the Ninth Corps. Now, despite a disastrous and drunken attack at the North Anna River in May, attrition in the officers' ranks bumped Ledlie up to division command. A member of his staff described him as a good soul, but a very weak man, no more fit to command a division than half the privates under him. Ledlie would again let alcohol get the better of him during an attack at Petersburg on June 17th, and he actually tried to resign his command in early July, citing health problems. But Burnside retained him, either shamefully ignorant of Ledlie's manifest shortcomings or unwilling to promote an equally unfit man, a fellow named Julius White, who had reported to the Ninth Corps for a senior assignment. In either case, Burnside is culpable for failing to isolate an officer characterized by a member of Meade's staff as a wretched, incapable drunkard, not fit to command a company. To make matters worse, multiple orders circulated regarding how the attack should be conducted. Now, Burnside's intention was to send the lead brigade toward the commanding high ground on Cemetery Hill. And some of you have probably been to Petersburg, and that's where the location of Blandford Church and Blandford Cemetery is. Union infantry and artillery up here on Cemetery Hill would have commanded 2/3 of the Confederate line. But Ledlie instructed his brigadiers to occupy the enemy works on either side of the blast. And then Potter and Wilcox would expand the breach, and not until Ferrero's division, last in line, would head for the key terrain up on Blandford Hill, Cemetery Hill. So not only was the worst division commander in the Army of the Potomac assigned to lead the assault, but his men would be operating under confusing and ultimately ill-conceived orders. Now, the Ninth Corps would have obviously primary responsibility for the initial attack, but Meade arranged for elements of the Army of the James on Burnside's right, and that's represented by the Ord's Corps of Turner's division and Ames's division you see here. And off of the map to Burnside's left, Gouverneur K. Warren's Fifth Corps. Meade also directed Henry Hunt's Union artillery to support the infantry, and Hunt would place 110 cannon and 54 mortars in position to bombard the Confederate lines and suppress rebel infantry and artillery resistance. The D-Day was set for 3:30 in the morning of July 30th. And at 3:15, Pleasance, accompanied by a fellow named Lieutenant Jacob Dowdy of the 48th Pennsylvania, and the mine's on-site supervisor, Sergeant Harry Reese, entered the shaft and put fire to the fuses. As one soldier expressed it, the suspense became painful, and strong hearts beat audibly, and brave men trembled, more from the fearful anxiety than a dread of the approaching conflict. When at 4 a.m. the mine had not exploded, Grant rode forward to Meade's command post to inquire about the situation. When by 4:35, the powder had still not ignited, Grant told Meade to order Burnside to attack even if the mine didn't explode, a remarkably reckless impulse. But 9 minutes later, Reese and Dowdy, who assumed that the fuses had burned out at a splice, crawled into the mine shaft. You can imagine the guts that took. And sure enough, discovered that the fuses had burned out at a splice, but they forgot to bring matches. So they had to scramble back out, go get matches, come back in, light the fuses, and then scramble back out. And at 4:44, the ground shook and swayed, and then a huge roar as if from the bowels of the earth belched forth, sending an amalgam of earth, stones, timbers, arms, legs, guns unlimbered and bodies unlimbed, skyward amidst clouds of dust and smoke, reducing Pegram Salient to a heap of ruin and leaving a crater in the earth, 126 feet long at the surface, 69 feet long at the bottom, 87 feet wide at the surface, 38 feet wide at the bottom, and 25 to 30 feet deep. The blast devastated Pegram's cannoneers and the men of the 22nd and 18th South Carolina, leaving 352 casualties in their immediate wake. Those Confederates who survived the explosion ran hastily to the rear, logically enough, leaving a gap in the line about 500 yards wide. But the sheer magnitude of this unprecedented spectacle, the lack of a guiding hand, and Ledlie sought shelter in a bomb-proof where he indulged in some medicinal liquor. And Ledlie's orders to hold the vacated Confederate line rather than rush around the crater and capture the critical high ground squandered the brief but certain window of opportunity created by the explosion. Well, again, here's a map that's too complicated for you to try to digest in its entirety, but the point is that Meade insisted that Burnside commit all of his troops, a division at a time, which soon destroyed all semblance of command and control. The Confederates were able to rally. They pinched off the gap at both flanks and began sending mini balls and artillery shells at the huge collection of essentially leaderless Union troops, compelling the Federals to seek shelter in the crater or around in adjacent works, barely venturing beyond the ground vacated by the rebels. By 9 o'clock, the Union attacks had ceased, and an hour later, Grant wired his chief of staff in Washington, Henry Halleck, that the offensive had failed and returned to his headquarters at City Point, 8 miles distant. Now, the initiative would shift to the Confederates. Reports of the crisis reached Beauregard and Lee at their headquarters north of the Appomattox River, and Lee ordered this fellow, William Mahone, to send 2 of his brigades from the far right end of the Confederate line to assist in the repulse of the Federals. Now, Billy Mahone was something of an eccentric character. He traveled with his own personal milk cow. He stood barely 5 feet tall and weighed around 100 pounds. When his wife was told earlier in the war that her husband had sustained a flesh wound, she responded by saying, "The wound must be serious, for William has no flesh." Now, Mahone selected his own former Virginia brigade, now commanded by a Petersburger named David Wissiger, and a Georgia brigade under command of Lieutenant Colonel Matthew R. Hall to answer the call. He led these perhaps 2,000 men on a clandestine march of several miles, deploying them in a shallow ravine about 200 yards west of the line now held by the paralyzed Ninth Corps. It's the worst place you ever saw. One of the Carolinian survivors warned Wissager's arriving troops, "You'll never be able to take it." Undaunted, the Virginians and some of the Georgians filed into place, determined to regain the lost ground. When we first set out on our expedition, we did not know that we would be called to lock horns with Negro troops, and they had charged our works with the exultant cry, "No quarter," we called a soldier in Wissager's 16th Virginia. The information gained, a stranger would have noticed a quickening of the step, and each eye burned with a brighter glow, and each gun received more than a casual examination to see that it was properly loaded and readied for action. Indeed, Ferrero's men had advanced last and managed to gain a forward position along the captured lines, shouting "No quarter," implying that they didn't intend to take any prisoners. And "Remember Fort Pillow," a reference to a widely publicized battle in West Tennessee in which rebel troops under Nathan Bedford Forrest had allegedly butchered black soldiers after they had surrendered. In turn, Confederate soldiers already assumed that any confrontation with African-American soldiers would result in death to one or the other party. And my friends, this is a formula for a very tragic encounter. The Virginians, joined by some of Hall's men and elements of the displaced Carolinians, about 1,600 strong, went forward across the 200 or 300 open yards, as you can see in this movement here, of open ground, enraged by the prospect of fighting black troops and further animated by the desire to protect their own homes, because many of Wissager's men hailed from the Petersburg area. The sight of Ferrero's men excited in the troops indignant malice as had characterized no former conflict, wrote a Confederate officer, creating in the men, he said, a hot rage. A vicious hand-to-hand encounter in which blood was running nearly shoe-sole deep in the trenches. Men fell in heaps, and human gore ran in streams that made the very earth mire beneath the tread of victorious soldiers, resulted in the Confederates regaining a stretch of their captured works north of the crater. Many of the Federal defenders fled, but enough remained to blunt Hall's subsequent attack. Shortly before noon, the fire slackened as both sides reassessed the tactical situation. The Federal survivors fashioned new breastworks, liberally stacking the corpses of enemies and comrades alike to create barriers against the flanking fire coming in from their right. Artillery shells and mortar rounds pounded the crater. One of the shells, for example, striking a man from a Maine regiment, the head and neck of the unfortunate fellow blown to fragments, the body falling, sloping downwards, and the blood rushing out as from an overturned bucket. Temperatures in the crater approached 100 degrees by noon, and the Union soldiers suffered terribly for the lack of water. Incredibly, volunteers ran the gauntlet of fire back to the main Union lines, draped with canteens, which they filled and attempted to deliver to their thirsty comrades. So it went on until I believe every one of those noble fellows returned with his gallons of water or perished in the attempt, wrote Captain Lyman Jackson of the 6th New Hampshire. It was one of the bravest acts I saw during the entire war. Similar examples of heroism attempted to bring fresh ammunition to the determined defenders, whose high command had long since given up hope and left Burnside to try to escape his dilemma as best he could. At the hour of 1 p.m., the bottom, sides, and nearly all parts of the crater were strewn with dead, dying, and wounded soldiers, causing pools of blood to be formed at the bottom, wrote the commander of the 45th Pennsylvania. It seemed impossible to maintain life from the heat of the sun. Now, Mahone had quickly realized that the Virginians and Georgians of his division would not be sufficient to completely redeem the lost ground. So he summoned the Alabama Brigade of Brigadier General John C.C. Sanders to the scene of action. The 24-year-old Sanders led 632 Alabamans on the same hidden route employed by Wissiger and Hall, arriving at the front late in the morning and deploying in the shallow ravine fronting the crater. Here they waited for more than 90 minutes, the heat almost beyond human endurance, testified an Alabama officer. Strong men fainted and were carried to the rear, the waves of hot air at times almost suffocating. Now, Sanders' men were told that both Beauregard and Lee were ensconced in a nearby home and would watch their impending attack, which was true. And here's where Sanders used great motivational psychology. Should it fail, he explained to his men, General Lee will personally lead you on a second try. Now, this fired the Alabamans with a determination to avoid placing their beloved Army commander in such danger. Finally, around 1 p.m., Sanders and about 200 additional Confederates received the order to go forward. What followed matched the most intense and brutal hand-to-hand fighting ever to stain the North American continent. Animated by the knowledge that the colored troops had gone forward with the battle cry of no quarter, the Confederates vowed to emulate the promise of their black enemies. Men were brained by guns and run through with bayonets, remembered a Confederate captain. The Confederates ringed the crater and, quote, poured volley after volley into the heaped up mass of terrified Negroes and their brave officers, recalled Captain William Fagan of the 8th Alabama. We recaptured all our lines, driving the enemy over into the crater like a herd of frantic buffaloes, said another. Then such a scene ensued as I hope never to see again. The crater was a seething mass of men, hundreds and thousands of them, some firing back at us, some struggling wildly to escape. Shattering volleys were fired into the seething abyss till it became a perfect hell of blood. In an effort to save themselves by displaying disdain for the United States colored troops, some of the white soldiers murdered their own black comrades in cold blood. Mahone, at last sickened at the sight of the surrendering soldiers being clubbed, stabbed, or shot down, ordered the slaughter to cease. When the firing finally stopped, about 1,000 Federals were left to surrender, only a small number of them African American. A South Carolinian confided to his diary that the Negro troops were slaughtered without mercy, we not allowing them to surrender. They huddled together in the pit formed by the explosion, and our men deliberately capped down on them and beat out their brains and bayoneted them until we were worn out with exhaustion. Some of the black prisoners were killed while being marched to the rear, and I found a diary in a rather obscure place from a Georgian, actually a collection of letters, and he wrote to his sister and he admitted that 4 black soldiers went to the rear within his view, apologizing, quote, that we could not kill them as fast as they passed me. And not only were there no repercussions from the Confederate authorities for this unprecedented massacre, but public opinion in the South justified the slaughter. I think it's perfectly right to kill every Negro formerly a slave and found in arms against us, wrote one Southern physician. This was perfectly right as a matter of policy, echoed the Confederate artillerist Willie Pegram. A Virginia private thought that the officers should not have stopped the butchering of the blacks, for they deserve such a treatment. The Richmond Inquirer, one of the best read newspapers in the South, editorialized that, quote, let every salient we are called upon to defend be a Fort Pillow, and butcher every Negro that Grant hurls against our brave troops, and permit them not to soil their hands with the capture of one Negro. Unbelievably, the paper then took General Mahone to task. We beg him hereafter, wrote the editor, when Negroes are sent forward to murder the wounded and come forward shouting no quarter, shut your eyes, General, strengthen your stomach with a little brandy and water, and let the work which God has entrusted to you and your brave men go forward to its full completion. That is, until every Negro has been slaughtered. The following day, Lieutenant General A.P. Hill orchestrated a parade of Union prisoners through Petersburg, intentionally integrating the column with black POWs, eliciting shouts from the approving civilian crowds of like, see the white and nigger equality soldiers. Now, both Meade and Lee played a shameful game of dueling protocols on July 30th and 31st, while the wounded left in the no man's land between the lines gradually died. Not until dawn of August the 1st was a truce enacted to retrieve the wounded and bury the dead. But by then, only a handful of survivors were found on the field as the growing number of corpses swelled in the stifling heat. Some of the bodies have burst open and the thick black blood is oozing from congested veins, testified a Union colonel. The faces and hands of many were actually white with a moving layer of maggots, wrote another federal officer. Finally, when flags of truce arose over this wretched scene, black prisoners of war emerged from the Confederate side, and the 35th Massachusetts, accompanied by an unidentified USCT regiment, wielded shovels and dumped somewhere between 300 and 700 bodies into long, shallow trenches. One Union participant recalled that, quote, I was on the field and oh God, what a sight. Men cut into 1,000 pieces and as black as your hat. You could not tell the white from the black only by their hair. The wounded were fly blown and the dead were all maggot eaten, so we had to lift them on shovels. I was full of maggots up to my elbows and such a stink I never experienced. About the time I was done, I was so sick I could not stand. As usual, casualty figures are only estimates, but the federal losses surely exceeded the 3,798 officially reported. The Confederates suffered more than 1,600 men killed or wounded, an attrition rate of 17.1%, not much less than that of the Federals. Ferrero lost 1 man killed for every 1.8 men wounded, as compared to the average combat ratio of 1 to 4.8, a stark reminder of the merciless and mortal combat that engulfed the 4th Division. Burnside's corps lost 23 regimental commanders. An official inquiry held shortly after the battle and packed by Meade with officers sympathetic to their commander resulted in Burnside being sent home, never to receive another command. Ledlie also received an end to his military career. Mahone would emerge as the hero of the day in the South, and the Battle of the Crater would be celebrated by Petersburg residents as about the only episode during the entire campaign worth remembering. Now today, the crater is the most visited portion of Petersburg National Battlefield, although interest in the Petersburg story draws far fewer visitors than many of our Civil War sites. The National Park Service emphasizes the construction and explosion of the mine and generally recognizes the failure of the Union offensive, paying much less attention to the Confederate counterattacks and the brutal nature of the combat. Surprisingly, the fate of more than 4,000 black troops engaged in their first test of arms is almost ignored on the battlefield, but there are now indications that park managers intend to rectify this oversight and in the process attempt to explain how on one day in July 1864, otherwise honorable men acted so savagely. Let us hope that in doing so, everyone who visits the crater can relearn the admonition offered to us by William T. Sherman. War is cruelty. War is cruelty, and you can't refine it. Thank you very much, Mark. I appreciate the opportunity to be with you, and if there are any questions, I'll try to answer them.
Thank you, Will. And as you said at the start, it is a sobering and tragic tale. We do have a couple of questions. How long was the gap in time between the explosion and the assault of the truce?
It's an excellent question, because during this rather biased inquiry that was conducted a week or so after the crater, one of the specifications that was leveled against Burnside was that he had failed to prepare the mechanisms for his troops to get out of their own trenches to make the attack. And therefore, there was a great delay in the assault, and that gave the Confederates time to recover their equilibrium. That's not true. It only took about 5 minutes or so for those soldiers to get out of their trenches. Burnside probably could have done a little bit more to have accommodated that, but that was not a factor. But whoever asked the question is obviously well informed, because that was one of the specifications against Burnside.
We have another question. By the way, anyone else who has questions, please use the chat function to type them in. So during the construction of the mine, how did they eliminate, you mentioned that there was a fire at the bottom of the shaft to help the air excavate. How did they conceal smoke from the fire in the shaft, which would have alerted the Confederates to what was going on?
You know, every time I've done this talk, someone has asked that question. I said, my God, Will, it's July. It's 100 degrees. What in the world is a fire doing? And I like to remind those people that, how did the soldiers cook their meals? How did the soldiers boil their coffee? With fires, with open fires. So the fact that there is smoke coming up from behind the Union lines was standard operating procedure. That was not a giveaway.
It's a reminder of a very different world.
Yeah, that's right. No propane stoves.
Question, let's see if there are any other questions. The question I had is, every time I hear the story of the crater, what were Burnside and the other division commanders doing for all those hours?
During the attacks, you mean?
Yeah, but it's all, you know, as you described it, it's all kind of bogged down and sitting there, and there's a lack of direction, and this goes on for hours. So what were they doing?
Well, to set the stage, and again, I'm sure some of your members have been to Petersburg, and they know these places, but Burnside's command post was at a place called the 14-gun battery, later known as Fort Morton, which was clearly in sight. It's on the tour road at the battlefield park, clearly in sight of the crater. Meade's headquarters was back almost a mile to the rear. And so there would be couriers and a telegraph line that ran from Meade's headquarters, which had been Burnside's headquarters, up to Burnside's command post. And those orders kept repeating, send more men in, send more men in. And so Burnside would give orders to his various division commanders, who approached the battlefield by means of what was called a covered way. And I think some of your folks know what a covered way is, but it's sort of a misnomer. A covered way is simply a communication trench dug deep enough into the ground so that men walking erect in that trench could not be seen above grade. It was a way to get people safely from point A to point B when they were in range of the enemy. And incidentally, there is the best covered way that I've ever seen preserved right there at Petersburg leading to the crater. But for some reason, the Park Service doesn't tell people about it. And when I take tours there, I walk folks through that covered way. It's really fascinating. So that's what's going on. Burnside is receiving orders. He's sending men in. He's hoping, that it'll be successful. But as we know, it was not. Grant rode forward once from where he was ensconced, not a place where he could see the fight. He rode down once, talked to one of the brigade commanders in the 4th Division, and then rode back. And as I say, by 9 o'clock, he'd given up on things. I'm a little hard on Grant. As those of you who've read my book, it's the first of 3 volumes on the Petersburg campaign. Volume 2 and 3 are in progress. And I'm an admirer of Grant, but these are not his finest moments. And so Grant kind of leaves Burnside and the 9th Corps to get out of their own mess. They don't even they ask for shovels so they can dig a trench going back to their main line and get away. They don't even get that. So that's really what's going on. And Burnside is arguing with Meade to at least hold the position that they've captured. Don't give it up. And Meade says, get out of there as best you can. And of course, there's no real good way to do it. Hopefully you can imagine what we talked about. The crater is a Confederate line, and it's advanced several hundred yards from the main Union line. And so to run from the captured Confederate works back to the protection of the main Union line exposes anybody to hundreds of yards of Confederate fire. So that's not an easy thing. That's not a really great option for you. So that's, hopefully that answers the question. There's lots of combat. Burnside is, against his better judgment, is funneling troops into the crater according to his orders, hoping for the best, but basically establishing a stalemate after Mahone's initial assault.
We've had a couple more questions. Were there any Union officers who used their own initiative to try to flank the crater and to try to move forward?
Good question, and the answer is no. Some of the troops that were in the Army of the James contingent to the right of the Ninth Corps actually came around onto the right flank of the Ninth Corps people and tried, I don't think necessarily intentionally to flank them, but would come in on the flank. But Confederates in a fort that's located now in the cemetery in Blandford Church just decimated those guys, and they couldn't go forward. I mean, that was a real death trap to go forward. The only way that attack, Mark, could have succeeded, and it very well might have succeeded to the extent of getting troops up onto the high ground. The Federals, I hope I made that clear. The Federals had a real opportunity to do that. Now, I'm not going to speculate beyond that point. What happens then, counterfactual history, I don't know. But it would have certainly put the Confederates in a compromising position. But when they failed to do that, when those leading troops created basically like a bottleneck, if that makes sense, nobody can go forward. Can you imagine? I mean, 10,000 troops in an area that's about 500 yards long and maybe 100 yards wide. If you can imagine that in your mindset, that's a lot of men. And as we all know from Civil War tactics, it's not an army of one. Civil War tactics were dependent on people moving in unison, according to orders, moving in lines of battle. So when you had no lines of battle, there was never an officer even as high as a division commander that came to the front. None of the division commanders came to the front. So the highest ranking officer there is a brigade commander, of which there were 8 brigades up there. So he had no even authority or any concept for 7/8 of the guys up there. It was not an army, it was a mob, an armed mob.
We have a question about when is the second volume of Campaign of Giants due out?
Well, I'm working on it hard. I expect to start writing probably this spring, and volume 2. And hopefully, I told University of North Carolina Press that I'd have the manuscript to them by the end of next year. So I would say that in 2023, we should see the second volume, hopefully, if everything goes well. It's an enormous story. Yeah. I have, my bibliography is 444 pages. I have 96 huge file folders full of material. And you think about it, Mark, you've got 200,000 guys for 9.5 months writing letters, writing reports, writing diaries, and then, having their memoirs. It's a lot of material to digest.
Well, good luck with that.
Yeah, thank you.
We have several more questions. First of all, was the mine technique repeated anywhere else during the war?
Grant blew up a mine. I think the most famous attempt was at Vicksburg in June, I think June 25th, if I'm right, 1863. A fellow named Hickenlooper dug a mine under a Confederate fort and blew it up and followed up with an infantry attack, which did not succeed, but the explosion succeeded. The Confederates blew up a mine a week after the crater. The Confederates blew up their own mine. But the Federals had gotten wind of it and moved the guns back. And so when the mine exploded, it didn't do any damage. And the Confederate attack was rather weak. But yes, I mean, there were several other examples of mining at Kennesaw Mountain, for example, in June of 1864 at, what you might know as the Dead Angle, if you've been to Kennesaw Mountain outside of Atlanta. Those Illinois troops that had gotten up to the edge of Cheatham's position there began digging a mine underneath that fort. They never got around to blowing it up. The troops moved on before they actually blew it up. But as I said, this mining, there was nothing innovative about mining in military history. What was innovative about the crater was the length of the shaft. That's what James Duane believed made he called it nonsense and claptrap, because that was just too long to ventilate without the Confederates finding it out. And it's to Pleasant's credit that he figured out a way to do it. But I mean, you could have locked me up in a room for 2 years and I never thought of hot air rises to create a ventilation system. But he did it.
We have a question. I know you touched on this about, the investigation after the battle, what happened to Burnside, but can you give us a little more about Burnside's fate and what happened with him? Sure.
Well, Burnside, I might be, along with Bill Marvel, the only two historians that kind of think Burnside was okay as a general. That's a talk for a different night. But Burnside gets, I think he gets a raw deal here. He had been, if you remember, Burnside, we all know Burnside we think about Burnside's bridge at Antietam. That is another talk, but that's not Burnside's fault, that's McClellan. We think of Burnside at Fredericksburg, and although he made mistakes there, William Franklin really is the guy that precipitates the disaster at Fredericksburg. Then Burnside goes off to the Western Theater, comes back in the spring of 1864 as commander of this 9th Corps, but is not integrated into the Army of the Potomac. So when Meade and Grant's overland campaign begins, the 9th Corps and Burnside are outsiders. They're outsiders. They're not part of the main army. Now, on May 23rd, Burnside very generously and selflessly agrees to waive his rank, because he ranked Meade. He said, well, I'll serve under Meade. Don't worry about it. I know I'm his senior, but that's okay. I'll serve under Meade. And so Meade and Grant integrate the 9th Corps. There's bad blood between Meade and Burnside. So, a combination of all those things sets up Burnside as a perfect scapegoat for whatever goes wrong. This court of inquiry that's held in early August is really something of a kangaroo court. Meade appoints officers for the court that are friendly to him and not friendly to Burnside. And so it's a foregone conclusion that he is going to be the one who's blamed. And Grant sends him home to wait for orders, and those orders never come. Burnside will return to the Army, incidentally, as a visitor. And he's extremely popular, remains extremely popular in his corps for the duration. Now, ironically, there's another sort of kangaroo court that's held in early 1865 by the Joint Committee for the Conduct of the War, which is infamously political and infamously anti-democrat. And so guess what? They have a meeting. They have a court of inquiry, they have a hearing, and they exonerate Burnside and blame it all on Meade, who's a Democrat and is always unpopular with the Joint Committee. So when we think about these trials that are going on today, whatever they happen to be, and we think, boy, that's really a bias, that's really a setup. There's nothing new. All that happened in the Civil War. So Burnside goes back to Rhode Island. He's elected governor, I think 3 different times. There's a beautiful equestrian statue, at least there used to be. I don't know if Burnside's been canceled in Providence, Rhode Island yet, but there's a beautiful equestrian statue of him in front of the state capitol in Providence. And he's a very popular fellow after the war.
Thanks. We have a question. Were the rebel earthworks reestablished behind the crater? Where did they establish their line after?
Excellent. That's an excellent question. And yes, indeed. And you can see that today. They simply incorporated the crater as part of their defenses. And they built what they called a cavalier trench, which is a high wall that was right behind the crater. And those of you who have visited Petersburg and visited the crater, if you picture in mind's eye, I probably should get a modern photograph of it now, but there is a large earthwork right behind what remains of the excavation of the crater. And that was the original or the subsequent Confederate line. And they simply incorporated that and returned and extended the original line and held it for the rest of the campaign. They held it for the rest of the campaign. Now, speaking of the crater today, people who come there are inevitably disappointed because they expect to see this giant hole in the ground, and it's just I mean, it's certainly discernible, but it's nothing like what it was originally. And you have to remember that Petersburg National Battlefield wasn't established until the late 1920s. It wasn't a Gettysburg, it wasn't a Shiloh, it wasn't a Vicksburg where the veterans came back and established a park and preserved the land. It was a golf course, there was a housing development out there. And so the ground was really manipulated quite extensively. So the fact that there's anything left in the ground, when I first came to work, my first job in history back in the Pleistocene era, when I started in this profession, was at Petersburg Battlefield. And at that time, the kids were riding their bikes down into the crater and back out. There were pathways through it and all that. It was really very poorly preserved. And today, of course, they've done a better job. But you can still see, you can certainly follow the mine. After the war, the private owners of that farm, the Griffith family, had a commercial attraction at the crater. They built a museum. They strung electric lights through the mine shaft up until the late 19th century. You could walk through the crater, go into the museum, see artifacts, and you could even buy souvenir skulls of Union troops, which shows you how tastes have changed. Can you imagine anything more grotesque than that? But that was considered a souvenir. So the fact that the crater is not what it was originally, I think we're lucky that we have what we've got there.
We have, let's see, another question here, which is, the mine was used to prevent, they wanted to prevent blowback through the mine shaft. Was
Right.
that successful, or were there any injuries from that initial blast?
Good question, and it was entirely successful. No, there were no injuries as a result of the explosion on the federal side, other than I suspect some of the dirt blew down back into the federal lines. But no, it was technically the only thing that failed was lighting those fuses, and that was because they got the wrong kind of fuse. Pleasance did everything he could. He spliced those together. He laid, I think it was a total of 6 different fuse lengths into little trenches that he also sprinkled with powder. So he realized that was going to be a tough thing. But despite his best efforts, all of the fuses burned out as splices. But other than that, the explosion was a great success. And it did everything that Burnside and Pleasance expected it to do. So in that regard, the crater was a successful Union operation. It was only the leadership is basically a problem with leadership. And isn't that the truth in history? Good plans can get screwed up by bad leadership.
It looks like one last question, which is, and this really relates to not just the crater, but the whole Petersburg siege warfare. and looking ahead to World War I and some of the mistakes there, do you know of any lessons that you think the military in Europe learned from this or failed to learn from what happened in Petersburg?
Ironically, my dad and I watched the movie 1917 today. Some of you, I'm sure, have seen that movie of all the trench warfare. I'm going to take a little exception to the premise of the question. You notice that I don't ever call Petersburg a siege. Now, if you want to call it a siege, that's fine. Lots of the soldiers called it a siege. Grant called it a siege. So I'm not going to quarrel with you. But to me, what are the two basic elements that comprise a siege? Well, I think one is that an enemy army is entirely encircled. And two, that there are what any army officer of the 19th century would say are specific siege operations, which, like at Vicksburg rather, involve the digging of saps or approach trenches, zigzag saps that come up to the enemy line. That's siege warfare. Well, neither of those factors were extant at Petersburg. Obviously, Lee was never surrounded. He escapes on April the 2nd. And Grant authorized Meade to do siege operations for exactly 24 hours in June. And then he called it off. So that Petersburg is a series of large-scale maneuvers that lead to very significant battles. Well, there were 79 separate named engagements in the Petersburg campaign. Now, certainly there were extensive trenches, and certainly there were periods in between these offensives in which the armies were relatively quiet. So, there's no question about that. But it really wasn't a siege. And my dear departed friend, Dick Summers, who many of you read his book, Richmond Redeemed, he and I had a running joke about, he kept calling it the Siege of Petersburg and I kept calling it the campaign, and that came up every time we were together. But if you look at World War I, I'm no expert on World War I don't think they learned a whole lot of lessons from 19th century warfare there.
It looks like we actually have one more final question, which was Pleasants an educated engineer, or did he have a miner's background, or what was his...
Yes, Henry Pleasants was a very good railroad engineer and a mining engineer. They were all, that regiment and Pleasants were all from Northeast Pennsylvania, Schuylkill County, anthracite coal mining area. And Pleasants was a trained and very competent engineer. And he, in his writings, his son wrote a book based on his father's reports called The Tragedy of the Crater. And you probably can find it today in used book sites. And, Pleasants talks about his ventilation idea as something that he had used in civilian life. So that wasn't innovative for him, but in an Army application, it was. Pleasants was a brilliant guy. He was very embittered by what happened, though. And as I say, at some point in my talk, I talked about how, Pleasants says that the Army was attempting to undermine his all efforts. That's an exaggeration. The Army just said, well, if you want to try it, go ahead. We're not going to stop you. We're not going to help you much either. And that embittered Pleasants because the whole thing turned out to be a fiasco.
Well, I think, Will, that is it for our questions. Wanted to thank you very much for sharing your knowledge, your insight on this story with us tonight, and hope you enjoy the rest of your stay in Scottsdale.
Well, thanks very much for inviting me, Mark. I really appreciate it. And all of the things, Tom, your help the other night, I appreciate that. And invite me back when volume 2 comes out.
Absolutely, we will do that. And everybody, March 16th will be our next meeting. I look forward to seeing you all there. Thank you and good night.